Our sermon series this fall is entitled, Who Do You Say That I Am? Each Sunday, that is the question. It is a question that Jesus asked his disciples at one point along his ministry with them. It's also a question that I hope each of you will consider for yourself this fall. Who do you say that Jesus is in your own life of faith? And each Sunday, our sermon will explore a different answer to that question that the writers of the New Testament provide. Our answer today, Jesus the Exorcist. Now, admittedly, this is not the most common name that you or I might use to describe Jesus, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all quite clear. During his ministry, Jesus was busy casting out demons. And so we come to our text for today, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, it's in the New Testament on page 816. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. The word of the Lord. I imagine that many of you here today are familiar with C.S. Lewis, with those wonderful books that he wrote, the Narnia series that so many of us read as children. Some of you may also be familiar with Lewis's delightful work, The Screwtape Letters. If you have never read The Screwtape Letters, I highly recommend it. It is a book where Lewis imagines a world in which an experienced devil is writing letters to his nephew, a novice devil, giving him advice. The experienced devil is named Screwtape, and the novice devil is named Wormwood. Screwtape provides all sorts of counsel to his nephew about the best ways to lead an individual away from, quote, the enemy, that is, away from God. At one point early on, Screwtape writes to his nephew, "The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination will help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to arise in his mind," that is, in the mind of the one whom Wormwood is trying to woo away from God, "suggest to him a picture of something in red tights, and persuade him that since he cannot believe in that is a demon wearing red tights, he therefore cannot believe in you." It's all imaginary. Screwtape, Wormwood, the person whom Wormwood is working on to try to keep him away from God, all part of the marvelous imagination that C.S. Lewis possessed. Is it all imaginary? What do you think? What do you think about that part about demons trying to convince the world that demons do not exist? Do we believe in demons? I don't think I believe in demons. In the movie The Same Kind of Different as Me, the story is told of a wealthy married couple, Ron and Deborah Hall. It's based on a true story, a book by the same title. Ron and Deborah have grown apart and their marriage is on the rocks. So Deborah decides to start volunteering at a soup kitchen in Fort Worth. She talks her husband into joining her with the hope that by loving the poor and neglected in their city, they might rediscover their own love for one another. In the soup kitchen, they meet a menacing man wielding a baseball bat named Denver Moore. This guy looks like he, to use Mark's words, had an unclean spirit. Denver is just tossing that bat around in the air. He does not have a home. He's lived a hard, painful, and dangerous life. But Deborah is not deterred by Denver's outward appearances, and she tries to win over his trust. Long story short, the Halls help transform the soup kitchen, and a friendship develops between Denver and the Halls. There's a scene in the film in which Ron takes Denver to the country club at which the Halls are members. They watch Ron's daughter play tennis, then they go inside to the restroom to wash up. Another member of the club approaches Ron as he is at the sink, believing that Ron is by himself. This friend says to Ron, "I think it's amazing what you guys are doing over at the mission. I do wonder, though, if you aren't taking things a bit too far." "What do you mean?" Ron asks. "Listen, buddy, you want to host a benefit? I'll be the first one to write a check. But we come here to get away from the world for a while. I'm not sure what good it does to remind us how fortunate we are over lunch." "Oh," Ron says, "you're talking about my friend Denver, right?" "Look," says his friend, "I like you, Ron. I like your wife, but many of us have a problem with you bringing him here." At that moment, Denver opens the door to one of the stalls of the bathroom and walks up. Denver has heard every word. So Ron just points at Denver and tells his friend from the club that Denver is standing right there. He can tell all this to Denver himself. Well, the man gets miffed and he leaves, and a big smile crosses Denver's face. "You got my back," he says to Ron. Now that's a nice scene in the movie, Ron Hall sticking up for his new friend Denver. I wonder how the gospel writer Mark would describe that scene. Would Mark say that Ron Hall was just sticking up for a friend? Or would Mark say that Ron was standing up to something demonic? Do you believe in demons? I don't know if I believe in demons. I do know that the gospel writer Mark sure does. 3 times in the first chapter of Mark, Jesus is busy casting out demons. And then we get to the 3rd chapter, Jesus is accused by his opponents of being possessed by a demon, and now we arrive at chapter 5, in which Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit. The man goes from howling among the tombs to sitting before Jesus clothed, and in his right mind. But you know, the most curious part of this story, to me at least, is not the demon or demons that Jesus exorcises from the man. It is the response of those who knew the man, who know him. Did you catch the response? Did you catch the response of the neighbors? Upon seeing the man no longer possessed by a demon, do the neighbors all celebrate? You're allowed to shake your head, no, of course. No, they don't. They don't celebrate. They don't throw a party for him. What do? They ask Jesus, no, they beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Why in the world would they do that? Mark does not tell us, but I would like to offer a theory. You can decide at the end of this sermon whether or not you agree with my theory. My theory is this: the neighbors were comfortable with the demon being in that man, in someone else, belonging to someone else. And then Jesus changed all that, and the neighborhood did not like that. They did not want changes to their status quo. Because that's what getting rid of demons does, right? It changes the status quo. And if Jesus changes the status quo in that man's life, what might he do to their lives? If Jesus sticks around in their neighborhood, Jesus might find something in their life that Jesus wants to change, whether or not they want that thing changed, whether or not they know it needs to be changed. Is it possible that Jesus might overturn their own status quo? Look, I think there's something in all of us that resists looking closely at our status quos, that does not like to change our status quos. You think I'm thinking about the New York Yankees right now. That's not at all what I'm really thinking about. In her groundbreaking book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander makes the argument that a system of legal discrimination and segregation has been born again in this country because of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. One of the fascinating things about Alexander's book, which came out almost 10 years ago, is the way she opens her argument. I reached the conclusions presented in this book reluctantly, she says. 10 years ago, I would have argued strenuously against the central claim made here, namely that something akin to a racial caste system currently exists in the United States. In other words, a little over a decade ago, Alexander could not see the deeply embedded problems with the incarceration of so many African Americans that has become the status quo in our society. But she goes on to make her argument in many ways with many different stories, citing many statistics. She writes, the racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Do you believe in demons? I don't think I believe in demons, actual creatures haunting our world. But I do believe in the demonic. I do believe that there are forces that seem to capture us, keep us all enslaved, chained to particular ways of living in our world, ways that are anathema to the will and way of God. It doesn't just happen at a communal level, it can also be at a very personal level. The late Jim Nelson was a professor of Christian ethics at United Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was also a recovering alcoholic. In his book, Thirst, God and the Alcoholic Experience, Nelson wrote, While still drinking, I persuaded more than one therapist that we should not be talking about my problems with alcohol. I was really convinced that if we dealt successfully with the, quote, fundamental problem, i.e., my childhood family issues, then secondary problems like alcohol use would evaporate. Finally, he says, I encountered a therapist who would not listen to my theory and instead insisted that we begin with my primary disease, alcoholism, and leave other issues until later. That approach did not please me one bit, he writes, but it was exactly what I needed. I don't believe in demons, not in actual creatures created by God, fallen to earth to haunt us here, but I do believe in demons. We all have our demons, right? Think for a moment. Is there any part of your life that tends to control you? Any part of your life you're too scared to change, or you've tried to change and you just cannot do it? We all have our demons. The desire to work hard can become the demon of perfectionism or status. The desire for a comfortable life can become the demon of quiet greed. The well-intentioned desire to help other people can become the demon of thinking that you and I can save other people. The desire to express your hurt and anger can become the demon of verbal abuse or the crime of physical abuse. The desire for intimacy can become the demon of promiscuity. The desire to help your child can become the demon of always trying to control your child. The desire to prove you're always in the right can become the demon of bitterness, holding that grudge so tightly you are never truly free. I don't know what demon you may be dealing with in your own life now. I do know this. According to Mark, God has power over the demonic in our lives. How do the demons respond to Jesus in our text? They don't respond by saying, "Come on, Jesus, bring it on." They say, in fact, they beg Jesus, asking permission of Jesus to enter the swine. According to Mark, God has power over the demonic. According to Mark, the God who comes to us in Jesus Christ can change anything. Now, that's a scary proposition when we like things just the way they are, when we are wed to the status quo. But it is powerful good news if you know deep down that there is some part of you that needs changing, that is desperate for the healing and holy touch of God in your life. I recall a story that Tex Sample once told. The story wasn't about Tex as much as it was about a friend of Tex's named Jimmy Hope Smith. Now, the first thing you need to know about Jimmy Hope Smith is that he had a thick accent. He grew up in Alabama. He retained his Alabama accent for his entire life, and when he spoke with that thick Alabama accent, he also spoke very slowly. The second thing you need to know about Jimmy Hope is that he was smart, like really smart, wicked smart, very smart. One of the things Jimmy Hope was really smart about was aesthetics. He studied aesthetics a whole lot. He knew Kant, he knew Heidegger, he knew them all, and what he enjoyed doing was going to a party and talking about art. And because of his very slow speech and because of his very thick accent, which he would sometimes exaggerate intentionally at these parties, there would sometimes be people at a party who thought that Jimmy Hope wasn't that smart. They had a preconceived idea of what smart was supposed to sound like. Some of those people at some of those parties would try to make Jimmy Hope look bad. Tex Sample said that trying to make Jimmy Hope Smith look bad about art was like kissing a rattlesnake. But I don't want you to think of snakes when you think of Jimmy Hope Smith. I want you to think about the time when Jimmy Hope and Tex Sample were at a church conference together. And the conference got done about 9, 10 o'clock at night, and they headed back to the motel along with 5 or 6 other folk. They found themselves in a motel room, one of those tiny, constricted motel rooms, just shooting the breeze with Sample sitting on the bed and Jimmy Hope sitting on the bed, and someone they did not know very well at all was sitting in between them. Before too long, they realized that the man sitting in between them was talking about something very, very close, something they were not prepared at that moment to know. The man began to talk about his wife's suicide, about how one day when he was away, she had lain down under their bed and took the drugs. He had looked all over the house before he found her. Then this man went into one of the most agonizing conversations anyone had ever heard about how he felt responsible for his wife's death, even though, by any reasonable estimate, she had suffered from the kind of chronic depression that all his care and compassion could never have rescued her from. His guilt, his fear, it was consuming him. It was possessing him. Jimmy Hope was sitting to this man's right. "I want to tell you something," Jimmy Hope said to that man. "I'm ordained, and by the power of Christ, I have the authority to forgive sins, both real and imagined." Then he drew the sign of the cross on that man's chest. I want you to know that from this day forward, you are healed. You are healed of everything you ever did to your wife, and you are free. You are free of everything you ever imagined you did to your wife. You are a free man. Sample says he heard from that man 3 years later. His life had utterly turned around. He was a new person. He was a free person. He was someone who knew that Jesus Christ really can change anything. Friends, the good news this morning is that the same Jesus who healed that demoniac long ago is sitting here with you today in this room. And the people he wants to set free are me and you. Amen.